Hi there, my name's Sam. I'm building out this camper van, and this video is going to be a detailed walkthrough about how to build a really sturdy upper cabinet. This cabinet consists of a continuous flat bottom panel and then a series of vertical panels that create each cabinet section. We'll cut the shape of these vertical pieces to match the angles and curves of the upper wall and ceiling of the van. Lastly, there's a rear lower support piece and a front upper support piece. Our bolts that secure the cabinet to the wall will go through these support pieces. To go along with this video, I also made a set of building plans for this cabinet, and the plans include the material list, the cut list, and the assembly instructions written out. The plans are available for purchase on my website, and I'll leave a link to them in the video description down below. Before we start working through the construction, let's talk about the rest of the design choices that went into this cabinet. Size-wise, I made this cabinet about 16 inches tall in the front and about 13 inches deep along the bottom. With upper cabinets in the small space that is a camper van, you need to strike the balance of making them large enough that they provide plenty of useful storage, but not too big and obtrusive that they're kind of up in your face and they make the headroom in the van feel too cramped. I think this is a pretty good general purpose size, but depending on where you have benches and other things in your layout, you do want to make sure they're not too deep that you hit your head standing up from a bench or other things like that in your build. Width-wise, I made the cabinet a full 8 foot long with the inside divided into 4 equal spaces. And I went with 8 foot because 1, that's the length of a standard sheet of plywood, and 2, it was just about the right length to fill the space in my van from the back here to just before the roof starts to curve down in the front. And this is a 148-inch wheelbase non-extended transit. You could take the same design of this cabinet though and pretty easily shorten it to any length you want. As an example of that, this is a test version of the cabinet I made. Same design, it's just shortened to 2 foot long and has no internal dividers. For materials, I made the cabinet out of plywood, specifically Baltic birch plywood, which is great for cabinets. Baltic birch is pretty dense and heavy as far as plywood goes, so I'm using 1/2 inch material to keep the overall weight down. And this 1/2 inch Baltic birch is what I use for the majority of cabinets inside my vans. The one exception to this is this upper support piece right here, and for that one I'm using 3/4 inch thick plywood because the extra strength is needed on this piece. And that's because this is the piece that I'll drill holes into to put bolts through where the cabinet connects into the ceiling framing. Another big consideration for cabinets in your van is how you want your wall panels to integrate with them. You can either do all of your wall panels first, and then you can put cabinets up that have open backs, or you can put your cabinets up first and then put wall panels around them. And if you do it that way, then you do open things up to making it possible to have some sections of wall that are easier to open up later if you need to get in there and do any repairs or make modifications that involve getting inside the wall. I go back and forth a lot on which way is better to build cabinets and wall panels, just because there's a lot of pros and cons to both, especially in terms of ease of construction and not making things too complicated. In my case here, the electric system in this van is going to be located on the floor over on this side, and that meant the majority of my wiring goes up this wall and runs behind this cabinet. Because of that, I didn't want this to get totally blocked off. So what I decided to do is put the cabinet up first before doing the wall panels over here, and I built the cabinet with removable backs, so I can pop the back out of the cabinet and have access to where those wires pass behind it. I also felt like this style of cabinet worked better with how I built my ceiling. I did this slatted design, and doing this I didn't have to continue those slats or have continuous ceiling behind the part where the cabinet is. The design of this cabinet though can work either with the removable backs or with no back at all. If you want to have wall and ceiling panels that extend all the way behind the panel, then when building the cabinet just don't include those grooves that the back panels slip into, and you have a simple open backed cabinet. And with all that said about the cabinet, thank you for hanging in there. Let's now talk about the actual construction process, which starts with making a template so that we can make sure our cabinet fits snugly into that upper corner, since both the ceiling and the wall curves and is angled at that top corner. It's easiest to do this with cardboard first before moving to our plywood. I started by cutting out a cardboard rectangle that is the height and depth I want the cabinet to be. 13 inches by 16 inches. When making a template like this for a cabinet part in the van, there's one more problem we got to think through, which is how do we know that we're holding it square so that the front face of our cabinet looks like it's vertical? And this relates to kind of a constant problem when building in a van, which is that you can't rely on a normal level to check things for being level or plumb. It's because the van isn't always going to be parked level. One side could be higher than the other, the front could be higher, it could be crooked, we don't know. What I do is reference everything off of the floor of the van. So I built the subfloor in here. I know that's a good flat surface, so I want to build everything to be level or square to the floor in here. Now in the case of this particular template, the floor is really too far away to make use of a standard square to make sure I'm holding this straight. So what I did is essentially make a really ginormous square. I don't know if we can even show this whole thing. So to make my ginormous square, I found two boards that had the straightest edges I could find, and I basically just used another square to screw them together and get it as square as possible. Is this thing perfect to some small fraction of an inch? Probably not. Is it close enough that I can use it for a reference for my cabinet template and have a cabinet that comes out looking pretty vertical? Yes, it's good enough for that purpose. Now I can use my large square to align my piece of cardboard in the upper corner of the van. Then I'll take my scribing compass and trace the ceiling and wall profile onto the cardboard. This is the scribing compass that I used for this. You can get these compasses in a variety of sizes. This is the one that I use the most, and this particular one only costs about $4. I'll leave a link to that and other useful tools for this build in the description below. I usually do my first scribe a little undersized, test fit it, and then do another pass to get it to a closer fit. Now, usually one template works for most of the length of the wall in a van, but for some reason, mine didn't fit right in the other spots. Not sure if it was that my framing isn't totally flat on the walls, or if it's just the shape of the van, but I ended up making 3 separate templates for the front, middle, and back. With my templates made, I started breaking down my plywood. One of the wide strips I'm ripping will become the cabinet base piece, and the other will get chopped up into chunks that'll become the vertical pieces of the cabinet. Next, I traced my templates onto the vertical pieces so I could cut these out with the jigsaw. One thing to pay attention to here is that the vertical pieces that are in the middle of the cabinet, basically the divider pieces, are shorter than the 2 outer pieces by the thickness of the bottom panel. This is because the outer pieces extend past the edge of the lower panel, but the dividers sit above it. I had to cut my 3 middle pieces shorter later because I had cut them all the same at this step. Next, I cut out the strips that'd be the upper and lower supports. Each of these strips needs an angle cut into it so that it matches the angles of our vertical pieces. I'll find these by using an angle finder along with a small piece the same size as the support pieces. I found that I needed to cut a 5-degree angle into the front of the upper support and a 2-degree angle onto the bottom of the lower support. I set my table saw to 5 degrees and ripped the edge at that angle. I repeated this with the other angle for the lower support, but at 2 degrees. The center vertical pieces have notches cut out in them for the supports to run through. I used scraps that were the size of the supports with the same angles cut into them to mark where I needed to cut out. Then I cut these out using the jigsaw. Next, I dry fit all the pieces together. If I was going to paint the whole thing once assembled, then I could go ahead and start the assembly steps now. But since I'm going to be applying laminate to these panels, I needed to do that now before drilling any of the pocket holes or going further. If you're interested in how to apply laminate to plywood, I'm going to make a dedicated video about it, but here's a super quick overview. First, the sheet of laminate gets cut down to pieces just slightly larger than each plywood piece. Then contact adhesive is applied to both the wood and the back of the laminate. Then the 2 surfaces are pressed together and a roller is used to apply pressure over the surface. Then the excess laminate is trimmed from the edges with a router. Okay, and now we're back to all the pieces dry fit together, but now with laminate. Next, I used some tape to mark where I needed to drill pocket holes. I'll also include a diagram of all the screw locations in the set of plans. Next, I drilled all my pocket holes. I have my pocket hole jig set up to drill holes for using a 3/4 inch pocket hole screw. I'd recommend testing the pocket hole setup on some scraps first to make sure the drill bit isn't set too deep. You don't want to have screws that end up poking through the other side of the board. I also need to cut a groove in the bottom panel and in the upper support, which the removable back panel will fit into. If you want the cabinet to be backless, you can skip these grooves. I did this on the table saw by only raising the blade about 1/8 of an inch for the lower panel. Here's the groove in the bottom panel, and here's the groove in the upper support. I cut the groove in the upper support somewhere around 3/8 or 1/2 inch deep. Now I'm ready to assemble the whole cabinet together with glue and screws. I'm using melamine glue since it's going on to laminate, but if you don't have the laminate, then stick to normal wood glue. I started by connecting the side pieces to the lower panel. I used a corner clamp to help keep the boards aligned. Pocket hole screws love to scoot the board forward as you screw them in, so some extra clamping is always helpful. I repeated this with the other ends and then grabbed all my center dividers. Rather than measuring where my center panels needed to go, I cut scraps of plywood that I could use as spacers. I got the spacer length by taking the total cabinet length, subtracting the added thickness of all the vertical pieces, and then dividing this by 3. My spacers were a little long at first, so I had to trim a hair off and then they all fit together. Using 2 of the spacers for alignment, I added glue and screwed down the first divider panel. Having the spacers on the opposite side of the pocket hole screws prevents the board from being able to slide over as the screws go in. I repeated this for the next 2 dividers. With the pocket hole screws, you want to make sure you don't overdrive them. Rather than using an impact driver, use a drill with a clutch mechanism so you don't drive them in too far and pop out the other side of the wood. Next, I got ready to glue and screw the upper support into place. I again used my spacer strips, this time resting on top of some spring clamps to make sure the top edge of the panel was aligned in the same spot as below. The ends attach with pocket hole screws. For the middle pieces, I used the countersink drill bit so the screw head would be recessed. Then I used a small bit to deepen the pilot hole so my screw didn't split the vertical panel. Then I added screws in from the top. I'm using a bit of a longer screw here than in the pocket hole locations so that it has a bit of extra bite. Finally, I added the rear support, which attaches with a bunch of pocket hole screws. Once it was all assembled, I could get ready to mount it inside the van. Here I'm just hoisting it up into place because I was excited and wanted to see how it looked inside the van. To mount the cabinet, I'm going to mix a couple different methods. In my ceiling ribs, I had previously installed a row of 1/4-20 threaded rivets that'd be dedicated for hanging the upper cabinet. Along the wall, I'm going to install 1/4-20 threaded wood inserts into the wall framing instead of using threaded rivets. The threaded inserts are about 3/4 inches deep, which is the same thickness as my framing. I chose to use these threaded inserts rather than plus nuts for the lower connection of the cabinet to the wall, really just because I wanted to test out how well these threaded inserts would work, and I thought they worked quite well. While plus nuts are stronger, I think you could probably hang the whole cabinet using these threaded inserts, and it would eliminate some of the annoying install issues that you can have with plus nuts or threaded rivets. Either these threaded inserts or threaded rivets are going to be stronger than just screwing the cabinet into the wall framing using construction screws, which is another method. That would be the simplest way, and I think plenty of people attach cabinets like that. I've even done it on past builds. But I do prefer the peace of mind of the strength of having a connection that's bolted in. So for my threaded rivets in the ceiling, I need to mark the location of these on the cabinet in order to drill holes for the bolts. The easiest way to do this is with a hanger bolt, which has threads on one end and a point on the other end. I threaded one of these into each of my threaded rivets in the ceiling, making sure that the point of it stuck down a little bit lower than the ceiling framing. Next, I lifted the cabinet into place and used some support arms to hold it up. I positioned the cabinet so there was a little over 1 inch of my front ceiling rib sticking out past the cabinet so I could attach some ceiling planks for filling in this area later. I used a mallet and banged on the cabinet under the location of each hanger bolt to make sure it made an indentation onto the board. For the threaded inserts, I made marks in the cabinet where I wanted them to go and drilled pilot holes there. I made sure the location of these wouldn't hit any of the bolts in the wall framing. I added 8 of these in total along the wall, and there's a total of 4 threaded rivets in the ceiling. Once these were drilled, I pulled the cabinet back out of the van. To install the threaded inserts, I need to widen the pilot hole to the size needed for the insert. After that, the insert threads onto the wood using an Allen wrench. The insert is then ready to accept a bolt. Now I needed to get the cabinet bolt holes drilled and recessed. Here's one of the indentations that aligns with the threaded rivet. I first used a small drill bit to transfer the location of the hole to the other side. Then I used a Forstner bit to make a countersink for the head of the bolt. It has to be a bit oversized to allow room for the socket to tighten the bolt. The Forstner bit needs to be used before the hole is drilled wider, otherwise you won't be able to drill with the Forstner bit without it jumping around and scratching up the wood. I repeated with the Forstner bit on the holes through the rear lower support. Finally, I drilled out the center with a 5/16 inch drill bit. Using a 5/16 inch gives the 1/4-20 bolts a little wiggle room or room for air. Now I could hoist the cabinet back into place and secure it with stainless steel hardware. I used a nut, a flat washer, and a split lock washer. Now, let's talk about the backer panels for the cabinet. I cut out these removable panels that are made from a thin and flexible ABS plastic. The material is 0.06 inches thick and came in a big 4-foot by 8-foot sheet rolled up. I used my track saw and cut a strip of it to the width of my cabinet interior, or actually a few hairs narrower so I had room to fit it into place. Next, I cut this piece in half, which left it longer than what I'd need so I could test fit and trim it to the correct length. Then I bent that piece into place and made a mark where it aligns with the rear of the upper support. I then cut the panel about a 1/2 inch longer than my mark to give it room to fit into the groove. This time I made the cut on the table saw, which worked fairly well but did have some chatter if it wasn't held down securely. I did a test fit and the size was just about right. It could always be trimmed a little more if needed. Finally, I used a Forstner bit to drill some finger holes to use to get it into and out of place. I clamped all 4 pieces together and drilled them at the same time, but this didn't work great as it kind of melted the edges of the holes together and required some extra work to clean up the edges of the holes. Instead, I'd recommend drilling each piece separately. Now I could pop them into place by getting the lower groove in and then with the help of the finger holes aligning the upper groove. Like I mentioned before, the top was a bit hard to align since the material bends so much, so I'd recommend making this groove wider. As a finishing touch, I added some pocket hole caps, which secure in place with a little bit of hot glue. That was it for the main part of the cabinet build. Now I just need to add doors and the accompanying hardware, the hinges and door latches. The door and hinge installation will follow as part 2 for this video. One more thing before I go, I did weigh this cabinet since I think it's good to keep track of how much different parts of our build weigh. When I weighed this, it was just the main part of the cabinet, so no doors or hardware included, and I set it on the scale and it measured at 37.6 pounds. You can make of that what you will, but just wanted to share what the weight of the cabinet carcass itself was. Anyways, thanks so much for watching my video. If you're new to my channel, subscribe to see more van build tutorials. See you in the next one.